Well, hello, every folks. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Who Wins the Thing. So today's episode was a bit of a rabbit hole. I've been running scenarios for days at this point, attempting to suss out all kinds of weirdly specific mechanics. Weirdly enough, this originally started with a comment somebody posted over the fact that technically speaking, we can test that Dispel does not actually get rid of permanent effects, courtesy of Beowulf, because while the White Mage doesn't get it, the Templar, or rather the Temple Knight does. Funny part is, yes, this is accurate. They can get rid of it, but the funny part is, and I want to point out, we're not going to be using this, just for context, because this is going to be such an annoying rabbit hole. But like, technically, his doesn't. But can we make the distinction between the White Mage version and his version? Okay, what would the case be there? Well, you've got the White Mage version throughout the whole rest of the Final Fantasy series that is apparently able to get rid of permanent effects, at least according to the wiki. I'm not going to go back, 3 decades worth of games in order to go test this on every one of them, but we also have the fact that we see a lot of effects coming out of something like Vagrant Story, aka the sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics, and the thing whose mechanics oftentimes were translated over to Tactics Ogre, and it seems like it gets rid of stuff there too. I didn't see anything with a direct permanent effect upon starting it, but it seems like basically everything is affected by Dispel in that one. So that's potentially also another argument to maybe be made there. I mean, oftentimes they would just be reapplied immediately, but it was able to get rid of a thing and then just reapply a thing, and that more or less seems to be the system that they were going with going forward. And additionally, you could also get rid of effects that were sort of beneficial things, because from that point onward, rather than having them just be like a permanent on switch, or giving you evasion to the dispel ability if you have a permanent effect. Instead, what they did was that it just always reapplied itself. That it was basically turn offable, but not like completely. It kind of seemed to be easier from a programming standpoint going forward, I guess. I don't know. But either way, just weird quirks on everything going down the list here. Because we had to test everything in order for this to make any sense whatsoever. Because between Ramza and Denam, this is like a stalemate for the ages between these two in a lot of cases. Like, in their base forms, like they're sort of however you casually played the game in either of these versions, where they probably don't have much sweatiness going on with them or whatever else, we still have a situation that the two of them would probably stalemate each other forever, with a very slight edge towards Denam there in terms of some offensive capabilities. And then if we end up going and just kind of maxing them out here, which I will say for the purpose of context, I didn't like completely max them out for this one, but it's basically assumed that their damage is functionally infinite in both these cases, but again, we will deal with those as we go along. What does this have anything to do with sitting around in a rainy field with frogs, though? Okay, so we will be comparing them directly going forward. But the thing is, I needed to test something. There was a particular stalemate theory that potentially allowed for the Evilist Chronicles version to have a shot here. Because you'll notice that we kind of have a little bit of an extra logo on that thumbnail over there, which is for the War of the Lions version. Because he needed to be more broken than he already is in order to stand a shot here. Because here's the problem. His loadout is very, very particular in this case. So at first I thought, okay, Invisibility Cloak, probably a pretty solid option. We've got a lot of good things coming off of this one. We've got the invisibility to start off with, so okay, maybe he sits and buffs himself forever, gets himself to max everything. Problem with that, invisibility falls off pretty much immediately, so okay, not very useful in that regard, but hey, universal evasion, still pretty good, so that helps us out there. Doesn't help him out with magic evasion, but that's kind of whatever. He gets at least some of that from his faith score anyway, seeing as he's got at least some evasion going on there, so I guess he doesn't believe in getting hit. Whatever, again, regardless, we are moving on there. Why specifically Excalibur plus Sleepblade here? Wouldn't Chaos do a hell of a lot more? Yes, but at this point, both of them have their damage capped anyway. It's not a matter of damage between these two, it's a matter of touching each other at all, and that's the weird complication here. For FFT fans, I know, Ramza is freakishly strong. He is basically an oncoming train versus an immovable object. That's more or less what we're talking about here. He's freakishly strong. It's comparable over on the TO side of things, but the layers of bullshit that go into their defense are really something else, and we'll get to that in a bit of a second here. So specifically, like, the thing is, whatever way you decide to go down this particular thing here, we don't even get a chance to start going down his skills or whatever else, because the problem is, as soon as the fight starts, he's already done. Why? There's a lot of stuff already covered by this. It's the fact that, okay, he needs the ribbon in order to avoid the debuffs. So many debuffs that are basically a death sentence on the FFT side of things are a minor inconvenience on the TO side of things at a baseline. So, for example, getting hit by stone immediately ends this fight right then and there. So he has to have at least immunity from something like stone, from toad, from any number of different things. So he's gonna at least need the ribbon. We've got almost complete coverage on the Wodel side of things, but we'll get to that in a second. Thing is, the ribbon is basically mandatory here. But, okay, so that's all well and good. He gets hit by the ribbon. What's with the mana shield then? Okay, so here's the thing. He can take any physical hit on a mana shield. Even 1 MP, it's going to go ahead and deflect it away. Fantastic. That is really good defense. And then we got summons. Summons are essentially a multi-hit magical machine gun. For all intents and purposes, the whole idea behind those is specifically stuff made to counter MP shields. It's a mechanic that has functioned all kinds of different ways throughout the TO series, but it's kind of like the Rafa and Malik stuff on steroids. We'll get to it in a little bit of a second, but effectively imagine somebody, instead of saying, hey, look, I cast really big meteor, is like, I cast 7 medium-sized meteors, and then they all just hit separately. It's essentially a swarm of magical micro missiles that is specifically made to get around, these kind of reactive armor type abilities. So, okay, so that mana shield is essentially getting burned and taken out immediately, even before we get into potential other options to get around this. The problem is, with all of this stuff, okay, so it gets reflected by Mirror Mail, and if this was using TO's logic, reflect should affect it. The weird part is, we see a situation over on this side where multi-hit abilities, for whatever reason, like if you go and use Rafa and Malik, you then have a situation that those just end up completely bypassing reflection. A lot of things bypass reflection. But here's the weird kind of argument in this particular respect here. Because technically, when it comes to reflection over on, the TO side of things, effectively, it is a directed reflection. So if something gets hit by a reflect, it is directly sent back to caster, whatever it happened to be. There are still things that bypass it in that setting, but it's more a matter of how it is specifically made to function. Essentially, no, you didn't hit me, you hit yourself. That it's basically taking that stuff and just, it's kind of the equivalent of, like, it warps from its intended target back to the sender, okay? The way that reflect works in FFT is more a case of it is deflecting it away somewhere else. So it's more of like a personal, deflection shield there, where it goes and moves it elsewhere, but it also seems to kind of have a bit of a tracking issue. The reason that I mention this is, I ran into a debate from something like 10 years ago that was basically trying to suss out what the logic is behind what reflects or what doesn't. And basically what people seem to be coming up with is maybe there's just like a range limitation, or maybe it's specifically, like in lore or something, detects MP use in order to activate or something. Because effectively we have a situation where calculations get through just fine, a lot of just regular spells get through just fine, a lot of anything physical gets through just fine, activated effects seem to not have an issue, or when it comes to things that are technically magic but not magic, that seems to get through just fine. So like Rafa and Malik's abilities completely bypass reflection. Reflected spells that are cast with arithmetics still get through just fine. And from what I understand, weapon effects like hit on effect type things get through just fine. I forgot to go and double check that one now that I think about it, but that does seem like, considering everything else, it does seem to be specifically you used MP and now I've activated kind of a thing when it comes to reflect. So it's weirdly inconsistent in terms of its ability to protect someone. And so that's the other angle of it. Reflect is a lot less reliable than I was hoping it would be for the purpose of this argument. Because essentially we are going to be looking at this as, from an angle of what is Ramza's road to victory here. Because yes, we're looking at a case where he's going and throwing out double 999s, which it's still hilarious that a goblin is able to dodge him at max everything at this point, but whatever. We still got a case that he's got what seems to be infinite speed, but here's the funny thing. Like, even in this particular scenario, like if we take a look at the timeline and stuff, even at completely maxed out speed, which is assuming he gets this far, he is potentially triple turning things, not quintuple turning things as I was originally kind of giving him the benefit of the doubt for. Occasionally he can do this if everybody is completely sitting still, or like if he's completely sitting still and not doing anything. But due to the fact that he still has to essentially pay the time cost in order to move, in order to act, all of that sort of thing, at most he can get 3 or 4 turns, 3 being more realistic, 4 being occasionally possible. The 5 part is only possible if all the numbers remain completely static. Okay, so that's a weird note as far as his max speed goes. Why would he need 5 turns specifically? We'll get to that. So I wanted to start it off here just to give you a baseline of the amount of testing that was being done in order to verify what we're talking about here and explain why we're going with the War of the Lions version as opposed to the Evilus Chronicles version. As good as the ribbon is of a defensive option, yeah, he's going to need other tools, and specifically One Ring in particular is kind of the one thing that gives him a bit of a shot here. So let's get to that. So here's the funny thing. This fight, it never happens. Realistically, the two of them walk up to each other, they shake hands, and they're just super freaking stoked that this is the first time that somebody actually took their offer of peace. It's never gonna happen. It is a total fabrication. It's nothing more than an illusion, because realistically speaking, they would probably just, in the background, sit there sweating over each other's builds and their respective scout menus, like going and attempting to counter each other forever before finally realizing how completely pointless and tedious this all is. You know, Denam probably feeling a bit more confident, but realistically speaking, both of them, like, neither one of them is particularly vindictive or whatever else. They probably wouldn't go for the fight. But yeah, we're just going to go ahead and throw that out there that, yeah, there's no shot in hell this fight ever takes place. All right. Anyways, moving on. Okie dokie. So here's our 2 contestants for today. We've got the War of the Lions version of Ramza over there on the left. His setup is looking a little bit like this, which also, I just noticed I forgot to explain the whole Sleep Blade thing. Alright, so the reason that the Sleep Blade was given to the other version is because there's a few debuffs in particular that the Tor version of Denam is particularly notably kind of weak to. The reason that the Sleep Blade in particular was chosen is because it's one of the few things that does actually turn off his bullshit shields, assuming it can actually get through and land its debuff, that also doesn't have some other benefits. So for example, even if he was hit with something that caused petrification, that would still raise his already freakishly high defense even higher, to the point that they probably wouldn't be able to get any meaningful damage off or any advantage or whatever else. Any debuffs whatsoever can potentially be shaken off, including Frog, so there's that too, and those just kind of shake themselves off immediately. I will also point out in this particular case that when it comes to the sort of like numbers that we're seeing on screen or whatever else, I'm leaving both of them just kind of doing AI fights in the background so that we have something to look at while we're talking through things. But bear in mind the relative numbers essentially over on Ramza's side of things. They're very close to kind of as high as they can reasonably go in a normal sense. Like, for example, his speed currently is 5 lower than the sort of normal maximum that a build would be able to achieve if they were doing the whole de-leveling thing. I'm really averse to grinding, as you probably have figured out in a lot of cases here. So there's any missing pieces are strictly like a function of that, okay? So there is going to be some stuff that I'm just going to explain rather than, you know, show. But again, that will be for that particular reason. Like, getting max 999 stats on frickin' everything on Denam is just... that is a level of finger pain that I just don't want to engage in, okay? So, at current baseline, he's currently somewhere to the ballpark of about 20% of where he physically could normally be. At the point that he's still, you know, taking no damage from boulders and things like that. So just kind of throwing that out there as a baseline. Anyway, I don't like doing direct, like, power comparisons or whatever else in terms of the typical scaling thing, because this isn't a function of power. Both of them, again, are still astronomically powerful at this point. Like, it's not an arm wrestling contest. It's literally just a case of which tank hits the other tank first. Those tanks aren't necessarily worried about how they're going to put the fire out as much as they are not getting hit in the first place, okay? And it's a surprisingly apt comparison considering that effectively you've got multiple different layers of what are effectively reactive armor type systems going on Denam. We'll get to that in a bit of a second. So, okay, the Wodal version of Ramza over here, we're going to be running Excalibur, Chaos Blade, Thief's Blade, Mirage Vest, Sage's Ring, Metal Arithmetics, Mana Shield, Dual Wield, and Mana Font in particular. Basically, that Mana Shield, without it, he is in a lot of trouble. So he wants that there. That helps protect him from a lot of things. Essentially, that shaves off like on-hit guaranteed weapon effects and things like that. Gets rid of a lot of things like that. The reason that he's going for dual wield in particular, rather than something more defensive or evasive, is because it's eventually possibly one way that he could theoretically get through most of the shield layers over on Denam there, which is again assuming that he's got completely maxed out speed, that he stalemated it enough to the point that he's able to max out his speed, attack, everything else. Yes, that is an assumption that needs to be made in this particular case. Thieves Cap, in particular, to prevent being hit with a leg break, because if he gets hit by that, that's just sort of the end of that. The Mirage Vest, in particular, to prevent poison, stone, and I think it was sleep was the other one. As well as the Sage's Ring, which is Wordline's exclusive, which causes him to absorb every single element. Without these particular options, any one of them would have essentially have been a problem. So, okay, let's go ahead and leave this AI doing its thing. Bear in mind the build that Denam is using over here is for the purpose of clearing out Palace of the Dead type stuff. Not for the purpose of actually winning this particular fight. And even in this case, where he's very close to his sort of default stats, he's still able to, just using the mechanics of his skill list alone, essentially go and clear out areas where he is specifically permanently de-leveled, running a solo fight. So yeah, that's a bit of a thing. Anyway, so, say hello to Denam and all of his ridiculous bullshit. Now, let's go ahead and throw a little bit of a save here before I forget. I don't know how long I've had this running. Anyway, so okay. Actually, let's go ahead and pop out of Palace of the Dead here real quick, because I want to address one argument before somebody even makes it. All right? So this is specifically in regards to the lore stuff, because one thing that comes up every time that this comparison comes up, somebody says, "Hey, you know, in lore, Ultima is a thing that's way stronger than it is in game. It's able to go and one shot the Lakavi bosses and whatnot. You know, it's so insanely powerful and whatever else." All right, so that's cool. That's all well and nifty. Lore-wise, I want to point out that, okay, if that can one-shot a boss, awesome. Somebody said, hey, in other, Final Fantasy games, like if we look at, I think it was like Final Fantasy 15, 16, whatever else, the one with the spiky-haired dudes in the car, they're like, if we compare Leviathan from that version to the one from FFT, then we have a city-destroying, monster kind of thing. They can basically summon a kaiju. All right, cool. We'll assume that too. Surely this should be very unfair at this point, right? Okay, so let me explain why this isn't really even necessarily a thing. Alright, so let's look at the map. The map of Valeria in Tactics Ogre. Alright, so first of all, the Majora Drift. So the massive sheets of ice endure 4 seasons without melting. That's kind of interesting. Between a swampland, another swampland, and some hills over here, why is there a mini Antarctica specifically right here? Why is there a desert over here? Just a random desert, just right in this particular zone right here. Why did this area randomly flood? And if we take a look at this little happy thing over here, during the Great War, King Roderick unleashed the power of the Apocrypha to vanquish an entire city, the remains of which float as an island among the clouds. Huh, that's weird that got there. What the hell's an Apocrypha? So those are the spells that he is basically throwing out for free. They're not even his strongest option here. But to give you an idea of the lore nonsense going on behind these things, we've got stuff like Heaven Judge 2 over here. So because the original Heaven Judge that vaporized an entire city wasn't enough. But we've got a situation where essentially we've got what are more or less like magical improved versions of existing spells. So, for example, going down that list, we've got Aeroflux, which is functionally just manifesting a tornado, just like a hurricane, just like right then and there, because why not? We've got the ability to cause earthquakes to happen. We've got the ability to cause lightning storms to come down out of nowhere. But in terms of the scale of these things, in lore, Ice Requiem was cast once during that war with King Roderick there, and it was enough to turn a place into permanent nuclear winter. We've got a case where Supernova was cast once to beat one of the armies that went against him, vaporized it instantly, and basically glassed the place into a desert forever. We've got a case where he went and had a city that he was trying to besiege. It wasn't going particularly well, so he cast Heaven Judge, the improved version of Exorcism. The original kind of SNES version of this instantly vaporized undead on contact. Essentially, think wholly on like 20 different types of steroids and then just like given the Dragon Ball Z treatment. That this thing is enough to take an entire city. Instead of just exorcising the undead, it just relocates the entire thing up to the sky to meet God. Vaporized everything there. Angels live up there now. Like that's just where they live. There's just divine creatures hanging out up there forever. So yeah, it's not even a level of just like pure nuclear destruction or what have you. It literally is just a case that the place is just pulled from the ground into heaven, for crap's sake. What is that? Like, the lore behind this shit is ridiculous. I don't know if they ever even explore what the hell's going on with Hades. And on top of that, that's the natural version. We've then also got the artificial version here in the form of the Draconics, because effectively the Palace of the Dead that was presumably flooded by the Dread Vapor spell over here, all 115 floors of it, that's essentially where all of this stuff came from. So it's the home of the Dragon Lords or whatever else. So basically they're functionally speaking Valerian DARPA, okay? They just research all kinds of weird magical shit, and sometimes stuff happens. Gift of Renewal over here, which basically is roughly to the tune of about 20% health renewal per turn. Nullify Strike, which is just an infinite shield against anything forever. Negate Spell, which is, the same thing for magic stuff. Sacrifice, which detonates one person to bring the entire team back to life, giving somebody the ability to teleport. Just relocating somebody a long distance, a short distance. It's just a bunch of weird, science-y versions. Essentially, they're science magic. That's the weird distinction here. Let's say you try to use natural spell boosting type of stuff, it doesn't work on this, but it also gives it a freakishly long range, but it's also inefficiently expensive. It's weird. It's just a weird kind of spells, but the original versions are basically like artificial versions of those magic nukes from before, and these are just something that people are carrying around. So, like, for example, Starfall does the same thing as that whole Heaven Judge thing, but just at a longer distance and what have you. So, okay, so we've got all of those things on hand. Lore-wise, it's a bit fucky-wucky, but that's kind of where that particular debate ends up landing. Okay, so let's talk mechanics, though. That's what I want to focus on. The lore thing, like that stuff gets all done. Okay, so let's talk immediate... Actually, no, let's break down his defensive options, because there's plenty. For the sake of context, when there's a scenario very similar to this that you actually run into when you're going and fighting the original final boss of this thing, of which there is actually a harder version. But anyways, so when you're fighting the original final boss, the guy is so freakishly fast that he basically triple turns you the entire time, uses a bunch of weird debuffs that would usually be like class exclusive or whatever else, summons down deities, including what basically seems to just be a giant death egg for whatever reason. That's just some sort of angelic super beast. I have no idea what that thing's supposed to be. So they're summoning down gods, they're going and warping around everywhere, they're bending reality, they literally just cannot stop shimmering from how much magical bullshit is going on, and again, they're doing the whole triple turn thing. The answer to this, very consistently, is a combination of Phalanx, Apostate, not Conserve MP, but Mother's Mercy. So here, let me go ahead and find that sucker over here. Where are my little ghibli dots? There we go. So, First Aid, which is basically like a low-grade regeneration. This is about 10% per turn. Apostate, which is a 3-effect magic shield until it activates again. Mother's Mercy, which is going to get rid of all debuffs at once. And then Phalanx, which is 90% damage reduction until the next turn. Now, in terms of 90% being 90%, you might think, okay, well, I mean, I'm still hitting 999s. Okay, the thing is, that's not the only layer. That's actually one of the main things that is a little bit of a weird debate between these two. Because damage in FFT is very free-flowing. Somebody gets damage, they now have damage. Somebody in TO has damage, it depends on the target's armor. So, for example, let's say they were hit by something dark-aligned and they were weak to it. Any bonuses only apply when they need to. So immediately 25% of all incoming things, potentially an additional 5% for racial things, so somewhere to the tune of like 30% of incoming damage, just off this accessory alone would be shaved off right then and there. On top of additional resistances off of these things, additionally another 90% off of this. So it's like, I'm not breaking down specific numbers here, but I'm just trying to say like it's layer on layer on layer of different defenses, because there's like a hard value on the armor, which is just the defense score that catches the initial hit. You've got the bonuses that are getting shaved off, that are applied closer to the end, and then you've got a second layer of reductions on top of that. So that armor be thick is what I'm trying to get at here. So already that's a just like weird mechanical advantage in that particular respect. So as far as being able to insta-kill that, very unlikely, because we see a lot of things that are similar, like very, very similar in terms of power. The final fight of, like the final hardest dude to fight in this entire thing is functionally speaking trying to be closer to a player character with a unique ability to instantly remove 10 of somebody's levels right then and there. The only way to remove it is for them to be killed and revived. And in that particular case, they're running so many bonuses that many bits of damage throughout the entire game, even the stuff that would have one-shot a god previously, just completely bounce off the guy, okay? And even in those situations, it's not that big of a leap for somebody to go use, say, something like summons to take 2 steps forward and just wipe them off the map entirely. That's how they farm for the Knight Commander weapons in this particular thing. And to give you an idea of the scale of Coda 4, it's kind of like, imagine in FFT, if you went and just fought all the Lucavi bosses at once, and then they all just got a massive power increase. They all went 20 levels above the maximum, and then they also got unique equipment on top of that. Like, that's sort of where things are moving up in that particular respect. And the way to get, for example, stuff like the Paradox Brynhildr in this particular case, essentially a alternate timeline version of one of the staple weapons of the series, is to actually do this while severely outnumbered, something to the tune of 7-1. So there's that. So that's just to give you an idea of how much durability is expected in this particular setting. Because, so the Lord class on Denam's side here is durable because it's essentially allowed to be every class at once. So, like, lore-wise, his whole thing is just if he got to the point of being assigned to, to be the Lord here, he now has to just sort of pick up a mantle that he was never intending to. So rather than being a normal class, essentially he is now a case where he has to just try to learn everything at once. He has to be everything because he no longer has a choice. Everyone needs him to step up. And so his answer to that is that he has one unique skill in the form of First Aid, and everything else is just a combination of every class that he has been through up to that point, essentially giving him the complete ability to use what almost every class can at once. Reflection over there from the Lich, Risk Management from the Berserker, Apostate over from the Buccaneer, Steel Stance from the Ninja, Vigorous Attack from the Warrior, Phalanx from the Knight. Basically, if this was a fight against anything beast or dragon related, he is completely immune to those in every possible context. But anyways, so this particular combo right here is okay, but it's actually not what we're going to be using here today. The reason that Ramza over there would essentially need 3 turns in order, or at least 3 turns to even do anything, is that he would actually have quite a few layers to get through here. So let's say he wanted to go use his calculations or something like that. Apostate is not reflection. Essentially, everything in this particular setting is assigned either physical or magical type of stuff. The relative simplicity of this mechanic is why he's able to essentially defend against a lot of things that, for example, stuff like regular reflection would not be able to defend from. Because Apostate essentially just says, hey, is this magical whatsoever? I don't care about the technicalities. Okay, it's just nullified. The thing is, though, it's 3 ticks. Specifically, like, the most dangerous one of these spells is going to be the Summon 2s, and these are specifically there for the purpose of burning through this, because it essentially is 3 magic effects of any kind. So, for example, it doesn't matter how directly powerful something is, it's just 1 attack. And there's not many things that do have multiple different effects that would be able to burn through it. This is one of them. And so, essentially, what they would be able to do is say, hey, this person has the shield up, I'm just going to go ahead and throw out 7 different attacks, and that just essentially slaps away those defensive layers, and then still get some damage through. Okay, so that's kind of nifty. So that's why the Summon 2s are so good in this particular setting, but the problem is, when it comes to calculations, this completely nullifies that outright. There's nothing that has multiple attacks in the magic tree there that would be able to go and burn this. So maybe in later games with a few other options, it's something, but yeah, this completely nullifies arithmetics. The thing is, this can basically be said of almost everything on their tree, and we're going to go down that list as to why he landed on arithmetics as opposed to anything else, because at least there's maybe a very small chance that he might be able to find some use for arithmetics support-wise, but he basically has to function on support because the one way he can actually get damage through is dual wielding. The problem is this is also completely nullified at a baseline. So we've got Mind's Eye over here that is going to evade 3 melee attacks, and then not Phalanx, this was actually supposed to be evade. So despite the names are a little bit of a misleading thing, okay? So when it says evade, essentially what it means is nullify. Where the hell did it go? Why am I not finding it? There it is. Okay, so why is this important? So, actually, come to think of it, this may not even be necessary, but we'll get to why in a second. So we're going to take off Starfall over here. We're going to go over to the Draconics, and we're going to go ahead and put on Nullify Strike. We're also going to go ahead and replace Heaven Judge over here with Gift of Renewal. Now, here's the weirdness of this particular setup, okay? In order to get any damage whatsoever, Ramza would have to go and essentially carve through all of these different layers in order to be able to do some damage, right? The Tic Tacs version would be at a distinct disadvantage in that they're not actually able to survive things like summons for that long until we get to this point. Essentially, even if their defense is higher, if their magic defense is raised, even if they're raising their resistances to something absurd, even if they completely stop believing in magic whatsoever, that is still something that's going to be hitting them. If we kind of try to find a middle ground between those two mechanics, like, we can potentially argue if he just goes completely, like, atheist on the whole thing, maybe that protects him, but I like to think that it's somewhere in the middle there. There are still options. We can make that debate happen. Like, if let's say we get to a position that he decides, okay, I've talked myself out of my faith entirely. He has swapped out his arithmetics for just being able to just talk. Actually, come to think of it, he can still use the Oracle version. No, wait, that wouldn't work. Okay, whatever. He uses a solution over from the talking tree to go talk himself out of having any faith whatsoever during his setup time, which he's somehow taking 2 actions at once. Don't worry about it. He hits himself with the atheist status, and now he just doesn't believe in magic anymore, so it doesn't hit him anymore. At that point, this just ends up swapping out for something else. So at that point, we end up going and moving some skills around in order to, let's say, go for a double attack there, because that mana shield still only gets rid of one thing at a time. Okay, well, let's say they get rid of their defensive layers, so let's say we had something like Nullify Strike up in order to make sure that equipment breaks weren't happening. Right? So we have a case where, okay, in this situation, he would be immune to the first 3 attacks. There would be a 4th one that's there as just sort of an additional layer. It's just sort of there. If you're wondering about MP, I should probably mention that MP actually works in reverse between these 2 games. So essentially in TO, it's constantly going up, but additionally, whenever fighting physically, they gain additional MP. So it's kind of an overdrive meter at the same time, which means that MP is in many ways not going to necessarily be an issue in this particular case. Okay. So let's get to the next thing. Let's just kind of go down the list of different options. Just kind of talk about why certain things would or wouldn't work. Okay, so items. Eventually, they would just be able to run them out of items. Like, that's basically the thing. We've got infinite renewal, infinite healing, whatever else, infinite defense. Items really wouldn't have much play there. If he switched his weapon out for a gun, that still would only be one effect. And you might be saying, okay, wait a minute. Well, what about like gun and then it hits with spells? Still counts as one instance. There's similar things to this in TO, and Evade Shield still would be able to protect against that. So we've got that there as well, plus they don't typically scale nearly as high as something like Night Swords do, so presumably that would be just kind of plinking stuff away. Okay, so what about Knights? What about equipment breaks? This is a pretty solid answer, right? And this is true. However, at maxed out stats, like I want to point out, this stuff over here is for the purpose of giving him stats at the moment. So if, for example, he was a max stats, he would be functioning the same way that he does now. He would be very slightly slower because the Crest of Fire reduces his overall weight. And even in this particular scenario, okay, so they essentially go and they take off their equipment. So this stuff is now broken. However, they don't have any skills that target these two slots, so they still have some armor in there. They still have some resistances in there. You could, argue some cases on min-maxing those. He would still have the ability on, for like teleportation or flight or whatever else if he decided to go down that route. But it's not even necessary, because at that point, essentially what's going on? Well, we still have a case that all of these shield layers are still in place. He just doesn't have a weapon anymore. He still has his spells just fine. Assuming those spells, again, are completely nullified, like if we just reduced his faith ahead of time, maybe to the point that he somehow got this low enough, somehow, despite the fact that one of these 7 hits is enough to just, like, vaporize most units in this setting. At max stats, I say most. The one exception would be something like a Dragon with Dragon Scale, which is also 90% reduction and reflection. So, okay. Knights and Dragons with their 90% reduction skills would be the one thing that would be able to stop one of the 7 attacks off this thing. But okay, we're still assuming he's completely immune. Then we still have this we still have this situation here where he still has all of these different abilities available. He still has that available. Assuming that he's still completely immune, then we also can just kind of go over this way and let's say get rid of one of these. And then we can just go ahead and, let's say, get rid of Apostate or something like that in order to go and give him Preempt. Why does this matter? Because the only reason that punch damage doesn't really... So the Preempt is basically, Hamido, or First Strike. Thing is, though, the funny part about it... Yeah, there it is. Alright. So, funny thing about all of this is that... there is no defense stat in FFT. They got protection, which he wouldn't have permanently up with the current build, but he doesn't really have an armor stat. The armor stat is the only thing that scales down punch damage, so effectively this would mean that this dude is more or less punching like a boulder, it more or less would be a case of, like, any time that he supposedly would be taking damage, effectively he would be dodging all of it and punching instead. So you've got the sort of like classic combo over there. But additionally, if any debuffs were ever to even land whatsoever, they would also go away immediately, with exception to stuff like Sleep, which would essentially take an extra turn and then it would go away. A lot of things, again, that would be a death sentence on the FFT side are just kind of minor inconveniences here. This is so much of a non-factor that at this point he could potentially throw in something else just to maybe have a little bit more of an offensive edge, like, let's say, Lament of the Dead. Because if he's hit with a debuff that prevents his turn, he can just wait it out anyway. If we're running a situation where, let's say, he's running something like Lament of the Dead, Fear doesn't really have a simile over on the FFT side, so again, presumably would not have a counter. If they don't have that particular thing on their end, I assume it's uncounterable. This is something like a 30% reduction in everything across the board. Defenses, offense, everything. Alright, so now we have a case that these punches do even more, and potentially this 90% damage reduction has reduced everything down to, theoretically, something like 1. Again, for the sake of scaling context here, one thing I do want to point out, just to deal with, I know there's going to be immediately a comment of like, oh, this sounds like bias. For the sake of context here, okay, when we're talking about like how they compare with the standard dude, so to speak, over on the FFT side of things, They can get freakishly strong to the point that they end up, let's say, landing their whatever maxed out hits or what have you, at a baseline. This would mean that even at like max level or whatever else, it's something to the tune of, I think like 50 was the maximum, something like that. So comparing with a like regular everyday dude, what we've got is a case where, like, over on Denam side of things, he's going to be roughly to the tune of 5 times directly stronger stat wise than a regular dude. Ramza should scale better, given that he is roughly 10 times stronger. But that's the thing, he hits harder, but he doesn't have defense. Like, he doesn't really have a defensive thing there. He can get a little bit more bulky, but he can't necessarily get that much more accurate outside of something like concentration, and he can't necessarily defend against a lot of things. A lot of stuff over on the TO side of things is more of a percentage scale kind of thing, and there's a lot of yes or no type abilities. So between these different layers, what we've got is essentially something like 20 or 30% essentially health restore per turn through renewal. We've got Nullify over there for essentially a shield layer that can be pulled up that is just one physical thing completely gone. Arguably, we could switch this out for something like Negate Magic or whatnot. And essentially on top of Renewal, we've also got another guaranteed 40% over here as far as sort of infinite options that are available. So he potentially has a full heal every turn if he wants it, or at least something very close to it, if any damage were to even hit him whatsoever. This is, again, assuming that he got multi-turned. Essentially, we've got 4 attacks that are nullified entirely, and then on top of that, we can potentially talk about defensive layers, because this is assuming that all of their shields were stripped off for half a second. Then we also have the other option that he probably should go ahead and be carrying some Jewels of the Avatar around. Now, the reason that this came up in a previous discussion, as far as why this is specifically here, is because when it comes to dodge and fall strike and stuff like that, it's not like increasing or decreasing accuracy in a normal sense. It is a guarantee. It is guaranteed that you are going to have at least 20% to dodge the thing, and assuming in this particular instance that he would have had to use Speechcraft in order to, do his thing, this would essentially give Denam over here the option to go run some other equipment instead. So, like, let's say in this particular case, he just decided to go, sword and board with the whole thing. And specifically, let's say we get something like the Aegis on there. Let's go ahead and say that he is just kind of running a full kind of defensive loadout and stuff like that. All right. Now, essentially, since he's given up equipment breaks at this point, which again have the convenient option over here to just be stopped entirely, now we have a situation that is near complete resistance to a lot of the things that are coming through, including things like the Aegis dropping about another 40% just casually on their own. This isn't even the sort of final form of this shield either, which is the absurd part. This is just a version that randomly dropped one day. Because it's basically 5% resistance off of just being a person. Then there's the respective elemental resistances, then the sort of weapon type resistances, which actually it's kind of confusing because it's checking the type of your weapon. So in this case, it would be an additional 9% off of just being a slash weapon, on top of another 6% people resistance off this armor over here, on top of more resistance over here. You get the general shtick, right? So resist, resist, resist. A lot of their defenses are specifically made to resist stuff. Now, the other weird defensive layer on top of everything else here is if we then decided, okay, so at this point, going down the list, so night stuff is just completely nullified by a single spell. Even if it was broken, it doesn't really affect the math very much. So okay, let's move on to the next one. Aim, same thing. Doesn't matter how high their damage goes, no is just no. Okay, we've got Monk over here on this end. Does he have anything? Same problem. He's got some recovery options, but no is just no. Oh, but what about Doomfist? He's gonna have Doom on there. Again, gets us down to why we had Mother's Mercy on there, because that is a debuff. A debuff that is completely removed. So there's that. What about Holy off the White Mage? Well, I mean, we already talked about the fact that he's immune to magic stuff if we want to. Well, we've got 43% reduction, 25% reduction, another 10% reduction, another 31% reduction. You get the general idea. Holy ain't really helping out very much. Okay, what about, the king of one-shots over there? We got the Black Mage. Same thing. We can just put on just complete magic nullification again, because now that he's got equipment again, he doesn't need preempt in order to punch twice. So screw it, we might as well just go ahead and put on Apostate. And this is assuming that we don't want to put Reflection on there, because Reflection, this version of Reflection, instantly puts the thing back on the other guy, which means that if, for example, if they were to do a flare, they would just directly do the exact same thing to themselves without worrying about what direction it bounced off in. It would just be directly on themselves. Yes, it is frustrating that the two versions of Reflection were completely different, and yes, it gives me a headache too, okay? So what about Time Age? We've got Meteors. Same problem. So nothing really helpful there. What about Summons? Maybe he could put up some Golem layers. It's something, sure. Not really much of a plan beyond that, but he's got Golems. He's got re-up on Reflection. Technically something. That would give him a bit more defense against stuff, but that's just against physical attacks, and in this case, presumably, he's rocking Summons instead. I want to point out also, by the way, because I know somebody's going to already have put the comment, what about, like, hey, if I put on lightning shoes, or if I put on some rubber boots, that'll get rid of Thunderbird entirely. Fair point. He can be any element. It's just here because I think the lightning element looks cool. He can be any element that he chooses to be at any given time. So there's also light and dark versions that I don't have on here, and more than likely he would be running his canonical light version, which is going to give him a stronger, essentially a stronger boost on a lot of the stuff that he's doing. And essentially at this point this would be switched out for Wisp Light instead. So it can be any element, essentially anything that he is potentially defending against, or that's not defended against, he can go swap out for. This is actually part of the reason that we're running the Wodel version in particular, and we'll get into countering the Sage Ring in just a moment. So Orator, we talked about their options already, and I want to point out that yes, the option for going and talking somebody down is certainly there. In fact, this fight probably never happens, realistically speaking. Realistically never happens. They probably just go and shake hands before even getting into anything. It's kind of sitting there as if it's like an Armored Core lobby or something, and they're just sitting and trying to counter builds against each other forever, until they're realizing, you know what, screw it, there was just no reason to fight to begin with. We finally have the one situation that somebody's going to bother listening to my requests for peace. So yeah, this fight never realistically happens. Anyway. So we've got that, but if he convinces himself the magic doesn't exist, that could potentially give him an option. As far as let's say turning somebody traitor or something, we actually do have precedent for that as well. Going and convincing somebody to switch sides is considered a physical action, and Invade does block it, funnily enough. So, yes, for some reason it blocks it. Somebody programmed that. I have no idea why. It's just funny that it's there. So yeah, talk skills are officially a physical action. Mystic, magic things, nullified, etc. Geomancy, not technically magic, technically physical, still technically one attack. Bit of a bummer, that's not helping. Dragoon, being able to jump is kind of nifty, doesn't really help in this case. Samurai, one single attack, that's the problem. Ninja, we borrowed the double attack because we're going to need that thing. Arithmetician can do a whole lot of things, but it can only do one at once, that's the problem. Bard would be useful. Vocal things count as physical, so there's that. I don't think the mime's going to help much. Onion set, really good as far as stats and buffs and things go. He kind of throws away a lot of his other better options, though. And then Dark Knight is partially something that he's already assumed to have maxed out at this particular case. And that's actually one of the other equipment options that's kind of interesting, because they get access to the Fell Swords. And as much as the two-hander category is neat for the purpose of this particular thing, like let's say we have the Valhalla over here, that would, in theory, be able to do the instant KO thing. The problem is that, yeah, it is still one sword, it is two-handed, and as hard of a hitter as it is, it wouldn't be able to actually land, because, again, evade layer. Evade and Mind's-Eye layers, for that matter. So even with multiple turns, they would need 5 actions in a row in order to be able to pull this off. This is why I was originally thinking that if his speed were to be raised high enough to be able to theoretically be able to swing through 3 Mind's Eye and then also shave off that shield layer and then take a chance at an insta-kill, that would essentially be his route to victory. And then it turns out 3 or 4 turns is the more realistic option, so effectively his better option in this particular case is to go and attempt to go for one of these things. Now, granted, we'd see a lot more damage coming off of something like the Chaos Blade, but we'd also see potentially more effect coming off of something like the Sleep Blade. The way that this potentially works is that they keep swinging to get rid of those layers until eventually they get to the point that they're able to land some kind of debuff off of a second sword there. So going on those options, we've got the option for Stone off of the Chaos Blade. Problem with that is that on the TO side of things, Stone wears away in like a turn, and additionally also increases defense substantially, so that wouldn't really help that much. Something like the Ragnarok would give you Shell, but again, no additional hit effect. Excalibur with its speed is already chosen for the first one. Something like Save the Queen, again, gives you Protect, not really helpful in this particular case. The other option would be something like Nagrarok, to go and turn somebody into Toad. Surprisingly less useful than Sleep in this particular case, because Toad doesn't prevent your turn, and you are still able to act. But wait a minute, they would be stuck as a frog. Mother's Mercy gets rid of all debuffs at the start of your turn. So that's, again, the sort of like weird thing that we're running into at this point. That like every option that he's throwing out there potentially has one more issue behind it. So theoretically, maybe it's possible to, let's say, swap out Excalibur for something like the Sleep Blade, but then we have the further layer that now he's lost permahaste, so he can't really get to that point. So this is already kind of like stretching the limits of everything that he can do. This is the one way for him to land a debuff past all of these different layers and defenses and whatever else. And even then, this is assuming that he's got at least 4 turns. The first 2 turns are completely wasted, but what about the 3rd and 4th turn? For one thing, not necessarily guaranteed. See, this is versus like rando enemies over there, over on his side of things. The thing is, Denam is not slow by any means. He's faster than a regular dude. So like, let's say compared with a standard soldier over here that you'd run around, the recovery time is 116. This guy's recovery time is 92. So essentially we're seeing something to the tune of like 15% speed advantage, give or take, you know, with the Fire Crest and everything, over a standard dude. So he's already a little bit faster in that regard. Additionally, we've got potentially the option of, you know, perma-haste and stuff like that, or just giving himself regular haste or what have you, if we, let's say, go and replace something like this over here. So we have the option for permanent uptime on this as well. If, let's say, the other guy decides to throw away something like Arithmetics, Apostate can be set aside entirely for, again, just automatic perma-haste, where he doesn't even need to take any time to cast this. He just basically has Excalibur in a skill slot now. So the reason that Arithmetics is there is specifically to take away one skill slot. Though, ironically, in the argument between these two, it's kind of Ramza that ends up running into the weird skill bottleneck there. So between all of these different classes and what have you, ultimately, it literally just comes down to how many times he can physically swing a weapon over and over and how much speed he can potentially get. And even at completely maxed out speed, he is looking at maybe 3 turns, which means, okay, the first 2 end up potentially shaving that off. We've got the shield layer. Theoretically, we could also double up on that if we wanted to go another way with it. But okay, so we're assuming that he maybe gets 1 debuff through and he gets sleep. If he gets sleep through, then he loses the 90% reduction. He loses the... Well, actually, the speed would still remain. He would lose the dodge layers, and then he would be able to get an undefended hit off, theoretically. Thing is, though, that, again, we're still talking about a case where if he puts on Speed Star, realistically, it's down to like 2 or 3 turns, so he probably doesn't get that far. And on top of everything else, this is assuming that we're not using anything offensive on this side. This is assuming he is staying completely still. Like, that's kind of the levels that we're talking about here. Meanwhile, let's talk about the layers that would be needed in order for Denam to go and do some damage on his end. Okay? So, let's say in this particular case, we've got a case where the Sage Ring is going to be eating those summons, so we can go ahead and take that off there. And let's say that we're looking at a case where Dispel is unable to go and remove permabuffs, so they're both going to potentially be running full speed. He's still got his activations, and let's say just to be ultra safe, he ran 3 skill cards and let's say a crit for his setup. Actually, not even a crit for his setup. He probably would just run a physical up for his setup. Probably replace Speedstar over here, and go replace it with something like Preempt. Now, why are we using Preempt as opposed to, let's say, a double attack? Because a double attack could give him some more potential options, right? But we have a funny little layer here that he can actually fuck with his accuracy, again, using guarantees and whatnot. So we talked about this earlier, but when it comes to False Strike, rather than blindness, False Strike is more of a hand injury than than an eye injury. So if we're using something like Preempt, effectively we have a chance of knockback of something to the tune of about 25%, so there's a decent chance the attack doesn't even happen. And on top of that, there's a pretty decent chance that we have a guaranteed miss chance added to any oncoming attacks, going up to, 20% there, potentially stackable, though realistically these are a usable resource, so they're just kind of here for the purpose of being here. Honestly, I'm not counting a lot of the item bar, because I want to only select options that are permanently available on account of the fact that this is a fight that is going on for fucking forever. So we now have a case that he's still able to land a hit, able to reduce accuracy, potentially prevent the attack from happening whatsoever before that attack even hits. And Preempt, the thing is, there is no limit on Preempt. Like, Mind's Eye is going to be 3 attacks. Preempt doesn't have any limit. Phalanx doesn't have any limit. So, effectively, it has to be the debuff that ends up landing that causes the issue. And this is, again, assuming that he's using his turn like every other turn, or rather every 3 turns or so. Gift of Renewal runs like 4 or 5 turns, depending on the situation. Boon of Swiftness is going to last something like 4 turns. Nullify Strike is until it's knocked off. So essentially, this completely counters that particular setup as well, which would mean that we're now going back to Arithmetics, right? And then if we were to have Arithmetics on there, honestly, we could just replace it with this over here, at which point you just kind of call the next attack that's coming, and that's sort of the end of that. Like, the defensive layers on Denam are total bullshit, is what I'm getting at here. So it's a case where, yes, the two of them basically parry each other forever. Ultimately, there is a slight edge for Denam there in terms of something like, Preempt still being able to get through. But wait, what about the MP shield? This is a good point. So, okay, so here's the really, really tedious, frustrating part of all of this. So, the thing is, the faster that Ramza moves, the more Preempts end up potentially getting off there. The more that he has to move, the more that he gets to re-up his MP shield. Because he's taking additional movements, he's going and he's slowing himself down more and more by taking full turns instead of partials, which essentially eventually means that we're now running into a situation where they're relatively on par speed-wise, where he's maybe only double turning him. That's still more than enough to completely, throw up all these different defensive layers. Essentially meaning that we're running into a situation where either on Preempt or either on his turn, he will eventually have a thing where he's got a chance to go and hit with this thing. Like I said, the edge on offense is very slight. But we now have a situation where if this False Strike ever hits, we now see him even missing, potentially even those double or triple turns are not going to be enough to get that whole situation through. And this is assuming that either one of those debuffs even lands whatsoever. But again, it could be like this for any particular thing. It's actually part of the reason that those specific debuffs were gone and prevented over on Ramza's side here, because this scenario also plays out with the Dragon Fang, 10% poison per turn, or rather per tick, and it ticking 2 to 3 times per turn is friggin' lethal as hell. Hell, we could replace this thing with something like Stun, which there isn't a direct counter for either, which, in this particular instance, would be a situation that stun would then also prevent 50% of his actions also. So now we've got, honestly, this would even be better than the False Strike there, because again, 50% of his actions just straight up fail now. So that's the thing here. The edge is slight, it's annoying, but it's there. Between the two of them, even with Ramza getting triple turns, he can still essentially just whiff. He can still just fail once all is done at the end of the day there, because he has to directly land all of these different attacks to be able to make this happen. I want to point out, I'm not talking about just dodge chance either. We've still got parry, because if it's basic attacks that are the main thing that he's doing, he's already got potentially, like if he wants to run a stunning sword, that is going to be a 14% chance to parry the attack. If he wanted to go for something a bit fancier, then we're going up to essentially a 21% chance to parry that attack. And hell, if we want to make the argument for things that are spell effects getting through reflections back on the Tic Tacs version, then we still have effects that are castable off of weapons like they're a freaking gun over this particular instance. I just didn't want to go down that particular route. But yeah, that's the thing that we're talking about here. I mean, if we wanted to, let's say, go over to, is there any reason to go for axes in this particular instance? Because not really. There's really no reason to do that whatsoever. You know, 1HKs also have a similar option in terms of having a stun weapon and what have you. Where the hell did I put that thing? There we go. So we got like a Muso Blade over here. Still gonna have the same like parry and stun combo over here. But yeah, no matter what way they go about it, we still land up in this same situation where even with almost complete debuff coverage, we just have a case where there's just going to be an edge in this particular direction. Okay, it's not major, but it's certainly there. And again, this is like even off of a sort of more baseline version of all of this stuff. In terms of how all of these layers would end up working in, you know, kind of more a more realistic sense, let's go ahead and I guess just throw them into a random fight over here, just kind of for the hell of it. Let's go ahead and throw him over this way. So yeah, the edge is slight, it's there. The miracle happens. He ends up getting the hit through. He ends up getting, let's say, a sleep off. Okay, that's so we're taking away that 90% reduction. We're taking away all of that kind of stuff. Here's the weird rub of all of that. With all of his stuff in place, so if he's getting to that particular state, he doesn't have access to equipment breaks, meaning Denam has access to his full stuff, which means he's still getting his resistances even in that particular situation. So a lot of bonuses from a lot of things just straight up do not apply, and the problem is most of that free-flowing damage is how FFT, you know, do. it's how everything works. Yes, we're talking about mechanical oversights at this point. So anyways, with all of that potentially being said, actually, there we go. They finally managed to get through his shield. An entire team managed to get through and do a tiny bit of damage. Holy crap. So I also want to point out, by the way, one thing that's worth mentioning. Well, actually, two things that are worth mentioning. First of all, I know somebody's going to say, "Hey, wait a minute! They only did like 1/3 on that Witcher-looking deal. What's the deal?" That's because this is again his like almost base stat version. I got a few charms on him in preparation for this video, but realistically speaking, this is like 700 stats across the board lower, if not higher, than he would normally be able to do if we're talking about this particular scenario. I just really do not want to grind that out. So there's that. Anyway. So as far as the other thing, though, as far as being able to get things through after a certain point, like where do they cap out in terms of how quickly stuff can potentially be gotten through? When do they reset, all of that sort of thing. So it's specifically the start of turn that causes a reset on their stuff there. So if their turn comes whatsoever, then it's stopped. If it's something like the Chaos Blade and they're able to, let's say, land their stone, that is potentially one free turn, but that is still going to raise their defense pretty significantly, because that's what stone does in this particular setting. It raises defense, but it prevents them from acting for a single turn. And even you again see this come up pretty regularly on that fight that I was talking about earlier for Coda 4, in which, let's say, somebody goes and gets hit by the Sanchin finisher off of Barbas. He goes and he gets petrified, and then we see a situation where he just takes ones from everything for a while. Even his lowest common denominator version is the same way. Aegis plus being hit with petrification leads to a very similar scenario there, right? And there's that knockback that I was talking about. So it isn't listed anywhere, but there's always a knockback chance on all attacks. So preempt, again, would more than likely end up preventing a lot of things from happening whatsoever. Stun would definitely prevent it, because it's 50% turn reduction and what have you. Yeah, dude's kind of ridiculous. So there's that. Anyway, so I gotta go ahead and start wrapping this up here. But yeah, between the knockback, between the parry, between the dodge chances, between the guaranteed dodges, between the defensive layers and the shields and all this other bullshit, he's got an answer for basically everything. And yes, this is including the technically more limited skill bar. So for anyone that wanted a 10-slot skill bar for this thing, could you imagine how fucked this would be in that particular regard? Because yeah, they're already beyond absurd. So yeah, there's that. Trying to think if there's anything else. I think that more or less covers it. But yeah, somewhere between summons and Swordmaster with a basic stunning one-hander. I love that it's the pun weapon that ends up being the really useful thing in this particular scenario. For those that missed it, by the way, the Damascus weapons, they all have a stun effect once upgraded because Damascus metal is stunning. Yes, it's so stupid, but I still love it. Anyway, okay. So that will go ahead and be about that. So y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.